Welcome back again to Ismael's Tech Corner. I'll be covering first the safety. You're also going to need a Phillips number 2 screwdriver and a Phillips number 1. Now that we have our basic tools, let's get to it. I'll start off with the CPU. One of the reasons that you need a CPU in your desktop build is to execute the instructions of your program. During my first build, I went with an Intel, and this time around, I went with an AMD CPU. Nowadays, when you buy a CPU, it's most likely that you will have a stock fan, and this is how the AMD stock fan looks like. The stock fan is a good option to start off with. Later on, people like to change it for water cooling. Next, we have the motherboard. Here we have the motherboard, which will hold all our components from our desktop. The RAM, the CPU, your expansion cards, storage, and much more. These 4 slots in front are meant for your RAM to be placed in. Right on top, right next to it, you have your CPU slot, that square looking thing. And then over here, you have your expansion slots, which I'll be showing later how to install a graphics card. And then over here on this side of the motherboard, you have your connections for your storage. Now for the installation of the CPU. The CPU has an arrow on the corner that would guide you on how to drop it into the slot. This is an AMD CPU, as I mentioned before, and it is a little bit different from my previous build. Now to install the CPU, you're going to first have to lift up this lever to unlock the socket. Before placing the CPU inside, double check that you are facing it correctly, and then go ahead and drop it safely. This doesn't require a lot of force, just make sure that the pins from the CPU go inside. Now that the CPU is placed inside the socket, let's return the lever back down and lock it in place. And there you go. Here I have my RAM sticks. This time for this build, I went with 32 gigabytes. So these two are 216 gigabytes. For this motherboard, I'm going to go ahead and insert the RAM sticks in this first slot right here and the third slot over here. The RAM sticks only go one way, so don't force them into the slots. You're going to go ahead and firmly press down. You may use 2 hands for this. Alright, there's the first RAM stick inside its slot. Go ahead on the second one. Same thing as the first one. Make sure you bring down this lever for your RAM stick to be able to go in smoothly. Just drop it in. Once again, it goes only one way in. Don't force it. And if you need to, use two hands. So for this storage, you actually need a flathead. The storage device, it requires to put it at an angle. Not force the storage device into the slot. It should fit in smoothly. And then all I need to do is bring it back down. On this side, I'll require to put in a screw just so it can stay in place. Now that the storage device is back underneath the plate, I'm going to go ahead and put it back in. Go ahead and screw the plate down, both sides. Alright, there you go. On the side of the motherboard, you have your peripheral connections, which means you have your USB, your Ethernet, HDMI, your audio. And now I'll go ahead and show how to install a stock fan. So right next to the CPU, you have 4 holes. You can go ahead and insert your stock fan. So there's a hole right here, another one right there, and there, and there. Below your stock fan, you do have this thermal paste right there in the center. Stock fan has paste below, that's default. You can remove it and insert your own, but I'll leave the default for now. So what I'm going to do is try to align each of these 4 legs. So I'll go ahead and align the 4 legs that are at the bottom of the fan with the holes on the motherboard. Once the fan is installed, I'll go ahead and screw the fan to the motherboard. And there's 4 screws for this fan. Now that the fan is installed, check the motherboard's manual and find where to insert the power supply for your fan. For me, it happens to be on this side of the motherboard. Once again, you don't need to add a lot of pressure. Just go ahead and insert it on top of the pins. Now I have installed the RAM, the CPU fan, the storage. So here's the chases laying down. I'm going to go ahead and insert the motherboard. And I'm going to guide the motherboard to be on top of these holders. So here I have the graphics card. I'm gonna go ahead and first show off the graphics card. And this really depends what kind of graphics card you grab. I'm building a desktop for the purpose of video editing, so I chose a 1660 Super. It's a glance of it. This one only comes with one fan. Others can come with two. I'm gonna go ahead and first install the motherboard into the chases, and then I'll install the graphics card. Now we're going to install the graphics card, and this requires two slots. And over here on the left side, we're going to have to remove two tabs. You can't see it right now, but there's screws at the end, and this is going to help sustain the graphics card in place. Let me start off first by removing the screws, and I'll show you in just a moment. There goes one. And to remove another one, you just firmly press against it, against the tab, and it comes off on its own. Careful not to hurt yourself. And then you can remove the tab by pushing it in. And there you have it. This will give enough space for us to insert our graphics card. And the slot for this graphics card is right here at the top. Some of these graphics cards are heavier and may require a back plate, but for this one, it didn't come with the package. I think that should be fine. There's also a lever for us to press down in order for the graphics card to fit. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the camera around. Make sure that the graphics card went in smoothly. To install this power cable, I need to connect one end to the power supply and the other end to the graphics card, which I'll show in a moment. Based on your power supply, the connection may vary. And place the power supply back into the case. I'll connect each power supply cable one by one. I'll start off with the motherboard. This is the one that has more connections. And this one goes right here on the right side. Just give it a snug. So that one right there was the power supply. This one right here, which has 8. This one right here that has 8 pins goes to the CPU. And that one's on the top left of this motherboard. Right there, hanging on the top left. And as you can see right there, it says CPU. Now I'll go ahead and connect the power supply to the CPU. Sorry for the mess. And whenever in doubt where the power connections go, check the motherboard. It'll also give you a clear description of where the power connections from the power supply. Connect to the motherboard and the CPU with their corresponding power cables. And now I'll go ahead and do it for the graphics card. This right here, right in front. This graphic card needs an 8-pin connector. And so I'll be plugging this 6-pin with an extra 2. Before even purchasing a graphics card, consider what power supply it will need. Make sure that you have the adequate power supply, or you may end up needing to buy another power supply. And for these connections, they can only go one way. No need to force any of these cables inside. Now that everything is connected, we'll go ahead and try to turn it on. Hopefully it works. I do want to mention that the SSD that I actually have on this motherboard was previously used and installed with Windows 10. So I'm hoping that it will turn on without any issues. But if anything, we'll just start all from scratch. And I'll clear out the SSD. So the motherboard seems to have the appropriate power. As you can see the light from the motherboard turned on. Now let's get a chance and see if I can turn it on and see what the screen shows us. So I realized that the monitor wasn't turning on because it wasn't connected to the power. Now that that is solved, if the motherboard is working correctly, you will see the screen. Now let's go ahead and press F1 to run the setup and see what happens. But at this point, everything was built successfully. And that's a wrap. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. Check them out, see what I can help with.